AWS Lambda functions have a new feature called function URLs, and it almost makes you wonder how we've got this far without them.
I don't know, Jeff.
And the best part of all of this is this new feature is included in the price of Lambda, so there'll be no extra cost.
It's free real estate.
This video is going to cover why function URLs have been introduced, what they actually do, and stick around to the end of the video as I'm going to do a simple walkthrough which will create a Lambda with a function URL using AWS SAM. Where function URLs really shine is in facilitating direct external calls to Lambdas. Up until this feature was released, external calls to Lambda were only possible by first going through an API gateway or a load balancer. So in order to access the Lambda function, we needed to understand, pay for, and rely on another piece of infrastructure complete with all its bells and whistles that we probably didn't even use because we didn't need it. But now we no longer have to deal with these issues thanks to function URLs. So what you'll now see in the configuration section of your Lambda function is a new category called function URL. Here we can enable a HTTPS endpoint that will allow us to call our Lambda directly. No API gateway or load balancer necessary. The URL is made up of a URL ID, Lambda URL, and the AWS region. The URL ID is based on a number of factors, including your AWS account ID, and they do warn you that someone could retrieve your account ID from it. So if that's something that concerns you, be careful out there, I guess. If you didn't know, you could create aliases for your Lambda function. Aliases are essentially a pointer to a specific version of your Lambda. Another useful aspect of function URLs is that we can now associate a unique URL to each alias. And this is going to be extremely handy in certain situations. When it comes to authentication and function URLs, we have two options. The first option is type none, and this is granting public access to our function URL. AWS still creates a resource-based policy document that's attached to our function, and public access is specified with a wildcard as the principal of the policy. This grants everyone the permission to perform the new action of Lambda invoke function URL. The second option is of type AWS IAM. This allows us to restrict access to only authenticated IAM users or roles. We then need to ensure that we add a policy statement for function URLs with the principal filled out with the ARN of the account, user, or role that we want to grant access. Function URLs also supports CORS if the URL is being called from a browser in another domain. Once everything is properly configured, our Lambda function can be invoked through its HTTPS endpoint via a web browser or any HTTP client of your choice. As some of you may know, there is an easier way to develop Lambdas, and that is using AWS SAM. So let's use it to create a Lambda and see function URLs in action. Alright, so let's get started then. In order to follow along, you're going to need the AWS CLI, the SAM CLI, and you could do with Docker for local testing too. I've done another video where I've gone over how to install these. It also went into a lot of detail about AWS SAM. I'll leave a link in the description and I'll also link to it at the end. If you do already have AWS SAM CLI installed, you might have to upgrade it because this is a relatively new feature to Lambda, so it's going to be a new feature to SAM. And you can do that using brew upgrade AWS SAM CLI. I had to do that, so. Okay, so let's get started then. I've created a directory, I've opened it in VS Code, and I've also opened a terminal in that directory. So let's start by generating a basic SAM application, and we'll do that using SAM init. And we're gonna choose AWS Quick Start Template, so 1. And we're gonna choose the Hello World example. I'm not gonna choose Python. No hating me in the comments. I'm just going to use a different language today. I've got no beef. And I'm going to choose option 10 for Node.js 16. And I'm going to choose to package it as a zip file. And I'm going to choose the Hello World example. And I don't want exo tracing just for this little demo. And we'll call the project testing function URL, although you can name it what you like. Just give that a second to complete. Okay, so it looks like that's all done. Let's have a look at what's been created for us. As you can see, testing function URL. And if we go to the template.yaml, we can have a look at what is going to be created in AWS. So for a reminder, or if you don't know, the template.yaml defines the resources that are going to be created in AWS, eventually by CloudFormation. So let's have a look at what we've got. Okay, so if you come down to the resources section, you can see something that I mentioned earlier on in the video. Lambda had such a dependency for external calls on API Gateway and Load Balancer that we've been given an event source of API Gateway straight out of the box. But for this simple demo and for many other use cases, API Gateway is far too sophisticated for our needs. So why should we maintain and pay for it when now we can simply just use function URL? So the first thing we're going to do is get rid of that. And we'll just get rid of the output as well that tells us about the API gateway when it's being deployed. And the next thing we're going to do is add to the properties of the Lambda function. And that's right, you guessed it, it's going to be the function URL. And for this, we're going to need function URL config. And for the auth type, I'm going to pick none. As we discussed this earlier, I'm going to pick none for simplicity just to make this run for a bit smoother. Okay, so once that change has been made, we have strayed off the path of the nice, cozy default SAM application, and we've made some changes. So it's probably worth checking that our template.yaml still conforms to the SAM specification, and we can find that out by doing SAM validate. So if we go into the directory that contains the template.yaml and we do SAM validate, fingers crossed, we should still have a valid template.yaml. And there we go, all happy. So once we've made that change to the template.yaml, we've checked it's valid. Now we can build the artifacts that we're eventually going to send off to AWS. So we can do that with SAM build. And again, you'll see that a build folder will appear, which I've gone into detail in my other video. So as you can see, that's successfully built, and we've got a build folder now containing the artifacts that we're going to send off to AWS. Let's just quickly double check that the template.yaml reflects our changes, and we can see that it does, so that's good. Before we deploy that to AWS, I'll just quickly touch on what impact function URLs have on local testing in Docker. And the truth of it is that not a lot. The reason for this is we already had the ability to invoke our Lambdas locally using Docker, so it was mimicking the Lambda runtime, which was really handy because it meant that we didn't have to deploy our changes, then find out we've made a mistake. We also had SAM start Lambda, which created a HTTP endpoint for all of our functions as well. So there were already options for this. So it doesn't change much in terms of the local testing, but it was already good to begin with. So no complaints there. All right, so once we're happy with that and it's all built, let's go ahead and deploy it. We're going to do that using SAM deploy guided, as it's the first time that we've deployed this function. So SAM deploy, and we're going to use the switch guided. And what this is going to do is just run us through our first deployment. Again, I've explained this in detail in my other previous video on SAM, so I'm not going to go over it too much. So for the stack name, testing function URL, the default region, which is fine for me. Confirm the changes. I'm happy with the IAM role. We'll disable the rollback, and the authorization is fine because the demo is just going to be public. Save to the config file. That's fine, and that's fine. So we're midway through the build, and you can see that it's asking for my permission to preview the CloudFormation change set. Do I want to deploy this change set? Which I do. And as you can see, we've got the IAM role, Lambda permissions, and we've also got the Lambda function URL. So looks good to me. So let's carry on with that. Okay, so it looks like it's successfully created. Before we go off to AWS, we can have a look in the AWS Toolkit extension. And if we have a peek in the Lambda section, we've got testing function URL that we just created. So it's looking good so far. Okay, so here we are then in AWS Lambda. And if we go to applications, we can see that we've got our SAM application that we created not too long ago, testing function URL. If we click into here, we can see that we have a hello world Lambda function, and we also have the hello world function URL. Okay, so let's actually check out the function itself. And as you can see, we've got our function here. We don't have a trigger as we removed the API gateway from the event source. And you can now see that we've got a function URL. If you go to the configuration, you can see that we've now got the function URL, and you can see that it's auth type none, just like we specified. So that's great. Okay, so let's test out the function URL. This is the basic hello world Lambda, so it's just returning a response body of hello world, and let's check it out and see what we get. Surprisingly, message hello world, but it's great because it showed that we used the function URL to invoke our Lambda. Okay, so that's all well and good, but what if we wanted to pass a custom event to our Lambda when we invoke it? We can do that too. But before I demo that, I'm just going to make a slight change to the Lambda code just to make this example a bit more worthwhile and just to make sure we can get some meaningful feedback from the event we're passing. The changes I'm going to make in the Lambda code, I'm going to specify let body, and I'm going to pass the body that's part of the event. I'm going to change the message that we're returning. I'm going to say, I like to eat, and I'm going to append body, and I'm going to have a variable called food. So let's deploy those changes. Before we test this out, let's make a copy of the function URL, and we'll hop back over to VS Code. And I'm going to be using the Thunder client in VS Code to send a HTTP request. So here we are. I'm going to specify our function URL to our Lambda. And the way we're going to pass our custom event to the Lambda when we invoke it is pass it as part of the HTTP request body. As you've just seen, the event that we're passing in is expecting a key value pair called food. So for our example, I'm going to have food, and I'll make it healthy. We'll say apples. Okay, so let's send that and see if we get the feedback that we're expecting. And there we go. The response we got is, I like to eat apples. And as you can see, we can change this round. Something more believable, donuts, and we get the response, I like to eat donuts. So there you can see we've passed an event as part of the HTTP request body, and when we've invoked our Lambda, that's been passed to the Lambda function. So there we have it. Hopefully this video has conveyed to you how handy function URLs are going to be going forward, and if it hasn't, I'm sorry, I try my best. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and I'd be grateful if you could hit subscribe.
Please, 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 please.
Also, drop a comment down below if you've got any questions. Cheers.